My name's Yvonne Rodarte Avila. I'm Kimberly Avila's sister. Kimberly disappeared on May 13th, 2017. She was only 32 years old. Kimberly was getting ready to go out. I think she was gonna go to a club. She had her makeup on, listening to music and dancing. Around maybe 2:30 in the morning, she said, "Hey, you know what? Let's go. Give me a ride downtown." And I was like, "It's already late." Well, I'm already ready. You know, she was the type, I'm ready. I'm like, "Well, why don't you just go out tomorrow?" Nope. She was very sassy sometimes. And, you know, I remember so clear that she's like, "Look at me. I didn't get ready like this to stay home." My brother, Ramiro, or Junior, was born male, but she dressed as a woman on weekends, going by the name of Kimberly. That's what made her happy, so we accepted it. We knew when he was growing up that he was gay because he would like to get my mom's shoes, you know, her high heels, dressing up. He was in middle school when he first came out. My youngest brother would play with cars, he would play with my dolls. So we knew, you know, that he was gay. He didn't have to worry about anything. We weren't gonna change him or trade him for anything in the world. He could be, you know, himself. And that's when, you know, he was at peace.
My name is Noe Avila. I am 34 years old, and I am the youngest out of the Avila family. Kimberly was a great sister to everyone, but he was also a little bit of a brother to me. So to me, he was Junior, and to our family, he was Junior. But to the friends and other families that are not living in our household, he was Kimberly. He was in a loving home. He loved each and every one of us. As far as the family, nothing changed. My father, he's an old school guy. You know, he's one of those macho type of guys, and he always supported my brother.
We had a very good relationship when we were growing up. We'd play hide and seek. That's like one of the major things that he would love to do because he would hide very good. He's very competitive. He would always beat us. But he was that caring type of person, very bubbly type of person. She was just happy all the time. Her thing was just music, dancing. He would say, "I'm just gender fluid. You know, I'm one person here, and then the other when I'm out there." And so that night, it was a Friday, so she was ready to go out. That's when she said, "Give me a ride downtown, and I'll see you in the morning." So I said bye to my mom and my aunts and everybody, and we got in the truck. On our way to downtown, she was very happy, you know, listening to music and dancing. This is where I dropped her off the early morning of May 13th, like around 2:45 in the morning. I told her I'll see you in the morning. But I drove around 3 times before I left when I dropped her off because I had this feeling that something was gonna happen. And I told her, "Let's go. You can come back tomorrow." She said, "There's a lot of people out here. I'm not gonna be here alone," which there was a lot of people out there. And I said, "Come on, let's go. You know, I'll bring you tomorrow." She was like, "I'll just be here for a little while. I'll see you in the morning." And I said, "Are you sure?" She's like, "Yes." But I went home to wait for her, and she never came home.
When I woke up the morning of May 13, that's when I started talking to my mom. She relayed the message that Kimberly wasn't returning the phone calls, did not arrive at home, something completely out of the ordinary.
She'd never miss coming home. She would call, and if she didn't have it right, My mom called me and said, "Are you sure he's not at your house?" She's like, "No." Then I told my mom, let me know when she gets home, So I waited. My mom kept calling me every hour. There's something wrong. I called every single hospital, asking for her to see if there was any information on her. I gave the description. I was going already into a panic mode. And there was a patrol car right behind Porter High School in the driveway, and I stopped. And I told the officer, this is what's going on. And he's like, "I'm already making the report of a missing person."
My name is Derek Garcia. I'm the morning news anchor over here at CBS 4 in the Rio Grande Valley. I've been reporting in the Brownsville area that's right on the southern border of Texas and Mexico. Brownsville is deeply rooted in Hispanic culture. Religion plays a big role here because so many people in Brownsville are Catholic. It is difficult for members of the LGBTQ community. Some who have come out have been rejected by their families, and others still have yet to come out because of that fear of being rejected from their family, because the Catholic religion and previous generations are just so deeply against it.
My name is Oscar Raul Lopez. I run a nonprofit called Poderosos to draw attention to the border communities. Brownsville is homophobic and transphobic. So the fact that the Brownsville Police Department actually took the information and started a file is important to note, because people just don't disappear. So Brownsville PD stepped up there. The police chief, the officers were respectful. They took the report down really early into the investigation and started looking into the case. In my opinion, historically, the Brownsville PD hasn't always stepped up to help the LGBTQ plus community. So I was really impressed initially because they were very responsive to the family.
It was a Saturday, so they told me that I had to wait for Monday to speak to a detective. In the afternoon, we all went downtown and we went searching.
We walked the streets of downtown for at least an hour. It was actually my whole family.
The area where Kimberly went missing, Washington Street and 12th, is closer to the International Bridge. The lighting was pretty bad. If you have 2 whole blocks of deserted buildings, that means there's no lights outside of them or inside of them that anybody walking by would feel safer.
I haven't been here in a while, but a lot has changed. There's a lot of lights now. I was checking to see maybe, something had happened in that place, and I could see something that she had in her purse that maybe was dropped. One of the very first places where I went to look, there's a huge trash can that used to be there. And my kids and I dug to see maybe something that would tell us that something had happened there, but nothing. We found nothing. She was nowhere to be found. We stayed until late searching and looking for every alley downtown. So we went home. We went home and waited. Monday we spoke to a detective. Her name is Melissa Gonzalez. She's like, "But do you specifically know what she was doing?" No, I don't. That day I don't know what she was doing. That's when she said, that she was gonna be the detective in the case, that it was a missing person case, that they were gonna keep us posted and updated and go from there. There was a reward issued from the police department for $1,000. They set up the hotline, if anybody had any clues or anybody had seen her, to go ahead and call.
If you know anything about this case, call Brownsville Crime Stoppers at 546-TIPS.
We started learning about Kimberly Avila pretty early on, even before police had gone public. The family had reached out to us hoping that they could get answers. Members of the trans community are no stranger to violence, and sadly, we live in an area where if you check those boxes that Kimberly checks, something could happen to you. For us as journalists, here's a family that is begging for answers, and that's our responsibility as journalists to find them.
A Brownsville man disappears without a trace. Police are now turning to the public for help.
Due to the proximity with Mexico, it's protocol for Brownsville police to check surveillance video at the international bridges. Investigators have been reviewing video of people crossing since this weekend. Still no leads on Avila. Police say every missing persons case is different, but in every one, time is a factor.
We have very little information. We don't have any indication to say that there was any type of foul play.
The initial response from the police department, I definitely was optimistic that, these guys they're gonna get it done.
Anybody working a case similar to this anywhere in the country would very quickly want to look at phone records. And that was the case with the Brownsville PD.
Kimberly had a phone that was not in service. She would use it to take pictures, but the phone that she had with her was not in service. It was disconnected.
Unfortunately, with Kimberly's case, she had no real digital trail. So the police told us that they ran into dead ends very early on.
I walk the streets every single day. I would get out of my house like around midnight and would go home like around 4 o'clock in the morning, walking to see maybe I would see her, to see maybe, somebody would bring her out. And I always went home empty-handed with nothing at all. Nos vamos para la casa a jugar allá. Sí.
Te van a jugar 10 minutos y luego vamos a jugar a la casa.
Okay. Camarón y pino.
La maceta.
Last time I saw Kimberly, it was May 12. We were having a late dinner with some family members that came from Mexico to visit us.
La rosa.
When my family comes over from Mexico, we all gather and we play loteria.
It's like bingo, but with different type of characters, like a mermaid or a sun, a moon, Loteria is definitely a tradition for Mexican people,
It's like this.
La corona.
You have to play that. Otherwise, you're not Mexican.
Buena.
Era un día como cualquier día que salía, o sea, no hubo nada extraño, nada más de que él se andaba arreglando. Entonces, para mí no fue nada extraño el que un día me dijo, mami, me quiero vestir de mujer. Yo le dije, está bien, eres como cualquier persona, eres mi hijo y tienes el apoyo 100%.
Para mí es mi hijo y a un hijo nunca se le da una espalda, sea lo que sea. Tiene que ver uno por los hijos hasta que Dios nuestro Señor nos lo recoja. Pero en todo el tiempo nunca le di espalda, nunca me avergoncé de él.
My name is Samantha Montemayor. In the Rio Grande Valley, I was with Gentex, a trans-led organization, and also a community leader, activist within the community of the Rio Grande Valley. The first time I met Kimberly, we were at a club, and I remember her. She was always smiling and making jokes. I feel that Kimberly was honored to have the parents she had, the siblings that she has, because they've been so supportive. Bronzeville or the Rio Grande Valley, it's different than any other part in the state of Texas. We're 10 years behind on everything.
We're still living in the world with discrimination, Sometimes it was extremely challenging because of the lifestyle that he had. Something as simple as going to the store and him, you know, just the way he walks or his personality, he was very open, very blunt. But we did encounter a lot of different situations where they used to try to bully him. Unfortunate. There's a lot of people out there that are closed-minded, that don't understand, you know?
Until our whole community can feel safe and blossom and have full-time employment and housing, then sorry, we're still a really homophobic, transphobic region that needs to be called out. So we joke around the Rio Grande Valley, which is where Brownsville is located, that when people want to move away from here because they want to go to the big city and experience that life and have more opportunities for school and work and just joy and culture and things of that nature, they turn to San Antonio, which we kind of all laugh at because it's just like the border, but bigger. Sadly, Texas is the deadliest place in the United States for trans women. We are #1 for the amount of women who get killed who are trans in our state.
Two days after he went missing and the police opened up the case of a missing person, we started to put up flyers. Myself, all our family members, and even friends started to help us place flyers all over downtown.
These are some of the latest posters Elvira Avila has posted on trees, walls, and storefronts around downtown Brownsville. They picture her son Ramiro Avila, also known as Kimberly.
Right about May 16th, my staff and I noticed posters in our downtown area with the image of Ramiro and Kimberly, and basically asking that anybody who had information to please call their number and to tell them about their whereabouts. And we haven't stopped working with them since.
We put up posters every single day. By next morning, majority of the posters were torn, vandalized, burned. Only her posters. There's a lot of posters up on the walls and only hers were damaged, only hers were torn, only hers were vandalized, you know, with a whole bunch of graffiti on her picture. That made us just want to come back more and more and more to see, you know, maybe who did that, to maybe catch the person that was doing that. I had people follow me when I was putting up flyers. When we would put up flyers, my family and I, we would see strange cars, you know, just following us street after street, you know, just watching what we were doing. It was scary. It was hard.
A lot of questions being raised about why those flyers were being ripped off. Is this the person who knows what happened to Kimberly? Was this a person who was with her?
There was one gentleman who was caught on camera defacing a lot of the flyers on multiple occasions, but when the police did stop them, question them, they determined that he was not a threat.
That was potentially a lead that police were looking into, but ultimately that lead came to a dead end also.
Detectives said that there's a lot of homeless people downtown, and there's a lot of, you know, mentally ill people, so they would blame them.
About a week after her disappearance, a tip came in that Kimberly may have been a sex worker in the downtown area. Police didn't confirm that, but when we went to her family, they told us the truth. Being a sex worker definitely heightened the level of danger of what may or may not have happened to her.
I've always heard rumors, you know, online and stuff like that, but it's something that I've never seen.
They say that she was doing the sex work. Yes, you know, it was something that he did not like to talk about, but I'm not denying it. I just can't tell you what she was doing out there.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. No one deserves to to be abducted, killed, go lost, put into a cold case folder, or just brushed off as missing until found, and then ultimately forgotten. Nobody deserves to be forgotten.
It's very hard for our trans women in particular to get meaningful employment and maintain it. So transactional sex is much more common because there aren't really any options. But if you identify as female, but you were assigned male at birth, often you want to be acknowledged as a female, desperately. For them, it's also an affirming thing to go out and do sex work because not only do you like me, but you're willing to pay me.
Kimberly is my best friend. The last time I saw Kimberly was like a month before she disappeared. She was super fun. She was like she was the nice person. She used to give everything to anybody. Like, you wanted something, here it is, you can keep it. Then she became a sex worker, mainly to help herself, to get some extra money for herself. We used to talk about it, but it's like, I'm no one to judge. So all of our friends, we used to tell her like, hey, just be careful out there. Just be careful because you never know what can happen. Because everybody knows how everything here downtown is. Yeah, it's downtown, it's really dangerous, and a lot of people kind of don't want to come towards this side.
How familiar are you with this hotel and what happens there?
Well, this is the hotel where all the sex workers come. There's 2 hotels. There's the one on the other side. They go inside.
Once they have a customer.
As soon as they get a customer, and...
I mean, that makes so much sense because you pay for the room.
Yeah.
And then you can use it.
Yes. Of course, there's a lot of violence.
So sad because even when they go to the police and ask for help,
police don't do nothing.
I believe that sex work did play a part in her disappearance. But police had no success in talking to other sex workers in Kimberly's case. They were afraid of the police, and then ultimately they were afraid of what happened to Kimberly could end up happening to them.
We know that a few weeks before Kimberly's disappearance, the police had arrested some of the transactional sex workers that worked downtown Brownsville. So the girls were reluctant to talk about what had happened because they were afraid that they were going to be arrested too.
That they just shut down and they never again have spoken about what they may or may not have seen.
Brownsville Police Department has a history of arresting commercial sex workers and their clients in the downtown area. It's a frayed relationship that's only harmed the investigation.
So here come the police, and then now they're coming to us for help. Well, we're not going to cooperate with the police because they're just arrested us or people that we associate with. So what do you do?
Progress in this case has been very difficult because of this history of mistrust between sex workers and the police department. Based off of sex workers that I've spoken to, they wouldn't go to police, period. Doesn't matter what the scenario is. The conversation that I've had with them is to say, well, what's the point? Police aren't going to help us. They never have and they never will. So that fractured relationship between the police and sex workers has absolutely harmed this investigation. They don't want to talk to each other, and they never have, and I don't think they ever will.
Detective Gonzalez would call us almost every day to let us know we have no leads.
It was very disappointing.
So at this point, the case is cold. And then in December 2018, a new lead comes in, and it doesn't come from the media, it doesn't come from police, but instead comes from a blogger on the website Run Run.
My name's Juan Montoya, and I'm a journalist. I've been a border journalist since '78. My first job was at the Brownsville Herald. Now with the social media, I run a blog spot, like an online newspaper here. We pretty much cover everything, from culture to crime. I keep my ear close to the ground.
Usage of social media has absolutely helped out in investigations. We don't have to just wait for police to give us answers. Internet tipsters, people who watch us can definitely give us those tips, those breadcrumbs, and we take all kinds of tips in a case like this seriously.
Brownsville is a very historical city. It's a very cultural city, but it's also a border city, which implies a lot of issues: contraband, crime, cartels. The underbelly of this city is contained in the little beer joints. They call them cantinas de la muerte. Beer joints of death, for lack of a better term. Kimberly, word of her disappearance got out quickly because she was a regular at these places, and she started not showing up, and her parents started asking where she was at, if anybody had seen her. The people on the street started talking about her missing, and the pictures started going up. I remembered, you know what? I remember seeing this girl. And then as I started talking to people, they started telling me that they had seen her there at that particular bar, walking out with this man. I was told by people that Kimberly was with a man who was associated with a criminal group. Well, that's the person that was seen last with her. And I don't think that the guy actually knew that Kimberly was not a woman. But they bought some beer and they were walking out the door at closing time. And they were getting into an argument because apparently the guy thought Kimberly had stolen something from him. And as they argued along the street, they was demanding something from her loudly, enough to wake people up. And him screaming to give him something back. And then the last they saw was her getting pushed into a car that was driven by somebody else off into the dark night.
Kimberly Avila was last seen May 13th, 2017. If you have any information, please contact the Brownsville Police at 956-548-7000.
If the suspicions are correct, Kimberly was taken across the border. The people who told me about this person, they know who he is. As much as I tried to prod them into telling me something that could be used to solve disappearance, they were not forthcoming because they thought they would get back to them. Along this border, the retribution is swift. I did go to the police with this information. They took it, and that's the last I've ever heard of it.
Right across the way from Brownsville is Matamoros, where you have a totally different level of crime and violence, rates that are vastly different from what you see in Brownsville. Once you cross into Mexico, who knows what happens next?
There was never any cooperation between Brownsville and the Matamoros police. To this day, there's never been anybody who's gone and said, this week, did you get any, somebody unidentifiable in your morgue? Nothing.
So our faith with the police department, yeah, it started not being as good as it was at the beginning.
I want to think that maybe they're just incapable and they can't say it.
New details in the disappearance of a local LGBTQ woman.
June 2019, another tip came in, and that tip must have been important for them to ask the family to hold a press conference at their house to bring all of us together.
Detective Gonzalez did ask us to do a press conference. There was a phone call, a tip that was made.
This morning, today, we are here with the Avila family at their residence. We know that there's people who know or have information on the case and they choose not to come forward.
The strange part about this whole press conference is that the police wouldn't tell the family what the caller said. They didn't want to tell us who this person was or what they said or any kind of descriptors that would entice them to call. So it had a lot of us scratching our heads saying, well, what is all of this about? We pushed police to answer our questions. They did not supply us with a lot of the answers to questions we were having.
We don't know what was said because it wasn't said to us. We don't know if it was a male or a female that called. We were never told what was said on that phone call. Why it's so important, we don't know. All they asked us to do was just to make that plea to the community. You had a reason to call that day. I'm begging you to call back. We're begging, I'm begging. Our pain is just growing more and more every day. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse.
But nobody ever called back. So the glimmer of hope was so real for the family, and then to have that sort of pulled out from underneath them was pretty heart-wrenching.
I try not to let my sister, my father, my mom, to engage in those tips/rumors. It only adds more sadness, more stress, and then if he's not there, and it's gonna hit you twice as hard.
To this day, we still don't know what that caller said or even if that caller picked up the phone again. After that press conference, radio silence.
As time went on, we didn't get any type of updates. The police department, they were not returning phone calls.
This week marks 2 years since a gender-fluid person was reported missing. The family has criticized investigators for not doing enough.
There's very minimal information that has come up recently, obviously. The longer it takes, the more chances that things will get cold. There's nothing concrete.
The people who have been really keeping Kimberly's story alive are her family. They have gone to every single interviewer. They've gone to every single news station. If somebody with a camera comes up to them, they don't say no. But also members of the trans and LGBTQ community. And Oscar has gone above and beyond to make sure that Kimberly does not end up in that cold case file column.
My staff and I led the organizing of 2 events every year, which was a birthday celebration of life. We also recognize the day that she went missing as the other day that we sort of acknowledged, and we do it annually. In 2019, we were working closely with the family to have a vigil for Kimberly because she was missing still, and we had no credible leads or anything.
Vigil was here, asking the public for help in searching, looking for Kimberly, letting them know that she's still missing, that we're still looking for her, that we haven't given up.
There is a vigil for Kimberly, and at that vigil is the Cameron County District Attorney, Luis Sáenz. He drops a bombshell on the family using the phrase, "We want to bring Kimberly's killer to justice." And up until that point, the family only knew that Kimberly was a missing persons case. I don't think any of us were prepared because we had never heard anything or any type of tip that Kimberly had been killed.
We were all in shock. My mother was looking at me, my father was looking at me, my brother's looking at me like, Yvonne, what's going on? I could hear people mumbling, and my mom started crying, my dad started crying, and we were like, what are you talking about?
I was standing behind the family, and I leaned over to the sister and I said, do you know anything about this? She says, no. And the mother, Kimberly's mother, was in the worst state, because at that moment, every possibility of her coming home was bashed by this man. So I went around the family really quickly up to the police chief and I said, what is he talking about? He goes, I don't know what he's talking about. That's the wrong case. I said, you need to tell him because look at what it's doing to the family. So he leaned over, whispered in the district attorney's ear, and the district attorney stopped mid-sentence, literally dropped the mic, and ran away with reporters chasing after him, who followed him all the way back to his office where he got in, locked the door, and wouldn't come out. It's unforgivable what he did because the family was already in pain and anguish, thinking the worst, and then he says that their child is dead when it wasn't even the right person. It wasn't the right case, and all it did was hurt the family.
Tonight marks 3 years since a transgender woman went missing in Brownsville, but her family tells CBS 4's Derek Garcia they believe police aren't putting the cold case at the top of their list because of her sexual orientation and her line of work.
No leads, nothing new, still investigating.
And no, we have not been able to develop any leads. I remain committed to the case as if it happened yesterday.
So we're now another year past with Kimberly's case. I think the question is, what do police need? I think they need a lot. I think they need an eyewitness. They need some sort of evidence. And most importantly, they need to know if Kimberly is alive or not. And if she is alive, she needs to come home. And if she's not alive, somebody needs to come forward. Without that, it's going to be another year. What happened to Kimberly, we don't know just yet. But we do know what has happened since she went missing. The LGBTQ community banded together and said, enough is enough.
The city of Brownsville created the first of its kind LGBT task force.
Every cause has an effect. And this was the effect of Kimberly's case. And I think that's a beautiful thing that came from Kimberly's case. I think it is rare for an LGBTQ task force to take effect anywhere on the border, let alone Brownsville. But to see it be born here in Brownsville is a great thing. And just because it's rare doesn't mean that it shouldn't be the norm. More cities can definitely learn from that.
The trans community and the police department have never had a very good communication or interaction. And by having a task force, an LGBT task force that's going to be there to represent you, makes a difference.
It is a bittersweet because we would have loved for her to be here and see the changes, but we're still missing her. You know, she's still not home. So yeah, there's a lot of good things that are coming out, but at the same time is maybe she paid a high price for it.
No, pues yo quisiera decirle que si es que me está viendo, bendito Dios, que vuelva a casa, que es su casa, que todo el tiempo lo ha sido, que estamos esperándolo con ansias, con ganas de verlo otra vez. Y es lo que Dios le pido a mi Dios, que me dé licencia de verlo antes de morirme.
What makes the Avila family so special is that they show up for each other and for Kimberly over and over and over again. Every night is a sleepless night, that wondering where their child is, wondering what's happened to them. But they don't give up and they lift each other up constantly.
Thank you, everybody.
Sometimes I'll tell myself maybe somebody, has her far away, but at least she's alive, And then there's some days that I'm like, maybe she's no longer here. But I still have hope that one day we're gonna know what happened to her. That's something that I'm not giving up. We're not giving up.
The call came in just after midnight, a thin voice cutting through police radio static, reporting a car idling beneath a flickering street lamp on a forgotten block where the city's noise fades into a restless hum, and when officers rolled up to the curb they expected a drunk driver, maybe a lover's quarrel gone stale, but instead they found a door hanging open and blood stippling the pavement like rain that had fallen upward, and in the back seat, slumped sideways against cold leather, was a man whose name would echo through precinct hallways for years, whose silence would outlive headlines, whose case file would gather dust thick enough to write one word across it in capital letters: cold. He was 32, a junior financial analyst with an office downtown, the kind of man who ironed his shirts on Sunday night and called his mother every Thursday, the kind of man neighbors described as quiet, polite, invisible until the moment he wasn't, and that night in early spring of 2000 the city swallowed him whole between a late dinner and the short drive home, no witnesses stepping forward, no surveillance cameras angled just right, only the sour smell of gasoline, the metallic sting of blood, and a wallet still in his pocket, as if to mock the simplest motive of all. Detectives paced the crime scene beneath that shivering street lamp while yellow tape snapped in the wind, the block sealed off, curious faces peering from apartment windows, rumors already traveling faster than squad cars. Because in this city a body in a car is never just a body in a car, it's a warning, it's a headline, it's a question mark burning itself into brick and concrete. And by sunrise the phrase, mysterious shooting, crawled across morning news tickers, followed by the sharper phrase, no suspects, followed by the one that would refuse to die, who did it? They traced his last known movements with mechanical precision, credit card receipts, a parking stub, a waitress who remembered he ordered black coffee he didn't finish, a bartender who swore he saw him check his watch twice, impatient, distracted, maybe expecting someone, maybe fearing someone, and investigators leaned hard into that maybe, because maybe is where cases live or die. Maybe is the narrow corridor between accident and execution, between random violence and calculated silence. Phone records revealed a call placed minutes before the estimated time of death, a number that pinged a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash 3 days earlier from a convenience store miles away. No security footage saved. No clerk who remembered the face. Just a ghost device that blinked into existence and then disappeared. And when technicians pried it open months later, after finally tracking its last signal, they found nothing but wiped memory and a battery drained to emptiness, as if the phone itself had chosen to forget. His family stood before cameras on courthouse steps, pleading for information, their voices steady but eyes fractured, insisting he had no enemies, no debts, no secret life, and yet detectives know that every life holds compartments, drawers that stick, shadows behind doors that only open when light hits at the right angle. So they searched his apartment top to bottom, boxed up hard drives, photographed receipts, mapped out his routines, every jog through the park, every coffee shop visit, every train he might have boarded, building a latticework of habit in hopes of spotting the one deviation that could explain a bullet fired at close range. Ballistics told a simple story, a single shot, clean, professional, fired from outside the vehicle through the open driver's window, the angle suggesting the shooter stood close enough to see his eyes, close enough to hear his last breath, and that intimacy rattled seasoned detectives more than a spray of wild gunfire ever could, because chaos is easy to fear, but precision implies intent, and intent implies planning, and planning implies a reason that someone, somewhere, is desperate to keep buried. Weeks turned to months, and months to a year, the case file swelling with interviews that went nowhere, tips that dissolved under scrutiny, one anonymous caller claiming to have seen a dark sedan speeding away, another insisting it was a pedestrian in a hooded sweatshirt who vanished into an alley, each description contradicting the next, each lead burning bright for a day before collapsing into ash. And slowly the media spotlight drifted toward fresher tragedies, fresher outrage, leaving this block to return to its ordinary rhythm, while detectives refused to let the file slide entirely into storage. Then came the first shock, a whisper from within his own firm, an internal audit revealing irregular transfers in an account he managed, small amounts siphoned over months, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to suggest someone testing the boundaries of trust, and suddenly the narrative shifted from random street violence to white-collar betrayal, from a nameless assailant to a possible conspiracy, and investigators dug into spreadsheets the way they once combed pavement for shell casings, hunting for patterns hidden in columns of numbers. Colleagues were questioned behind closed doors, tension thick in conference rooms where corporate smiles once ruled, One co-worker sweating under fluorescent lights, another lawyered up within hours, but every trail circled back to the same infuriating conclusion: the transfers were real, the discrepancies undeniable, yet there was no evidence the victim orchestrated them, no proof he uncovered them either, only speculation that he might have stumbled onto something bigger than himself. Something that transformed him from analyst to liability in the blink of an eye. As the second year passed, the label hardened. Cold case, two words that feel clinical, but carry the weight of surrender, though surrender is never spoken aloud in a precinct, and the detective originally assigned to the file kept a copy of the crime scene photograph in his desk drawer, the street lamp's pale glow reflecting off the windshield, the open door frozen mid-swing, a reminder that somewhere between that dinner receipt and that final phone call lies a truth still breathing. Community meetings reignited the story each anniversary, candles lining the sidewalk where blood once dried, neighbors speaking of unease that never quite faded, parents walking children a little faster past that corner, because unresolved violence lingers like humidity, invisible yet suffocating, and the question returned with each flicker of flame: was he targeted? Or was he chosen by chance? In 2004 a new angle surfaced, a former college friend stepping forward with a confession that sounded rehearsed and yet cracked at the edges, claiming the victim had confided fears of being followed, of noticing the same car trailing him for weeks, a detail never mentioned in earlier interviews, a detail that could have been paranoia or could have been prophecy, and detectives chased that phantom vehicle through parking garage records and toll booth data, piecing together partial plates that never aligned, building a mosaic of near misses and dead ends. The city changed around the case, new technology emerging, surveillance cameras multiplying on corners once blind, DNA databases expanding, but the evidence collected in 2000 remained stubbornly limited: a single bullet, a few latent prints smudged beyond clarity, fibers too common to distinguish, and each technological leap felt like a taunt, progress racing ahead while this file stayed anchored in the past. Years layered over the memory like sediment, detectives retired, new ones inherited the binders thick with transcripts, photographs yellowing at the edges, and each fresh pair of eyes saw something slightly different. A discrepancy in a timeline, a witness statement that didn't quite match cell tower pings, the gap of 12 minutes between the final call and the estimated time of death that refused to close, and in that gap lived every theory imaginable, from organized crime to personal vendetta, from financial fraud to mistaken identity. The family never stopped calling, never stopped asking whether anything new had surfaced, their grief evolving from raw shock to a quieter, more dangerous form of endurance, birthdays marked not only by candles, but by absence, holidays punctuated by an empty chair, and in interviews years later his mother would say she still listens for his key in the door, still imagines the case solved with a single knock from a detective bearing answers at last. By the end of the decade the file occupied a shelf labeled with a number rather than a name, efficient, impersonal, yet inside it remained the same haunting image of a car under a trembling street lamp, the door ajar, a life interrupted mid-sentence, and though the city moved on, though headlines screamed about other crimes, other shocks, this one persisted in the background, a low, constant thrum, because somewhere out there a shooter walked free, blending into crowds, aging year by year, carrying a secret that could shatter the illusion that this was ever random. And as the years pressed forward, as technology sharpened and cold case units reopened forgotten files with renewed hunger, the question that began on that silent block refused to die, growing louder with time instead of softer, echoing through hallways of justice and memory alike. Who stood outside that driver's window in the dark of 2000, and why did they decide that this ordinary night would become a headline that would never truly fade? A decade after the gunshot cracked the night, the file was pulled from storage again, not because of a miracle tip or a dramatic confession, but because a newly formed cold case unit in New York City decided that unfinished business was more dangerous than forgotten crime. And when the cardboard box was set down beneath fluorescent lights in a cramped office, dust rising in a slow, accusing cloud, a young detective ran a hand across the lid and said quietly that somewhere inside these pages was a mistake, a detail overlooked, a pattern missed, because murders like this do not vanish, they wait. The city in 2010 was different from the one that existed in 2000, wired with cameras, stitched together by data, cell towers mapping movement like constellations, and the first order of business was to re-examine what technology could now extract from old evidence, to treat the bullet not as a relic, but as a witness, to treat those smeared fingerprints not as failures, but as latent voices waiting for amplification. And technicians carried sealed envelopes down sterile hallways to labs humming with machines that hadn't existed when the case was born. Ballistics reanalysis confirmed what detectives already suspected. The weapon was a 9mm handgun, common, unremarkable, the kind sold legally in countless shops across state lines, but microscopic striations on the recovered slug told a subtler story, slight imperfections that suggested the barrel had been modified, perhaps filed, perhaps altered to distort its signature, a deliberate act that whispered preparation, not impulse, and that single detail shifted the narrative again. From street-level confrontation to calculated execution. They reopened the phone records, this time cross-referencing the ghost prepaid number with expanded databases that tracked similar devices activated within a narrow radius, and a pattern began to flicker at the edges. A cluster of prepaid phones purchased within weeks of each other, all paid in cash, all used briefly before going dark, and one of those devices pinged a tower only 2 blocks from the victim's apartment 3 nights before the murder. A coincidence too sharp to ignore, a digital footprint that felt less like noise and more like intention. Detectives tracked the convenience store chain where the phones were sold, digging through archived transaction logs, interviewing former employees who barely remembered the turn of the millennium, and one clerk, now older, slower to speak, paused when shown a faded still image pulled from long-retired surveillance backup, his brow tightening as he recalled a man who wore gloves despite mild weather, who avoided eye contact, who paid with crisp bills and declined a receipt, a man who did not belong to the neighborhood and did not linger. A composite sketch was drafted from that fragile memory, lines etched onto paper that captured a face both generic and unsettling, a face that could blend into a subway crowd without a second glance, and when the sketch was released quietly to internal databases, it triggered nothing immediate. No dramatic arrest, no knock at a suspect's door, only silence that felt heavier than before, because now they knew someone had taken steps to erase himself, and erasure requires motive. The financial angle resurfaced with sharper teeth, forensic accountants combing through archived servers recovered from backup tapes, reconstructing deleted files byte by byte, and in one recovered spreadsheet they found annotations hidden beneath layers of formatting, small comments that read like warnings, cryptic notes about discrepancies, initials that did not match any employee on record, and timestamps showing the victim had accessed these files hours before his final phone call, as if he had discovered something that made him reach for his cell in urgency. Investigators built a timeline that tightened like a noose. Late afternoon at the office, accessing questionable accounts, early evening dinner alone, distracted, final call placed at 11:47 p.m., estimated time of death shortly after midnight, and between those markers lay a gap of escalating tension, the possibility that he had confronted someone, or threatened to report what he found, or agreed to meet under the pretense of resolving a dispute that would instead end in blood on pavement. Former co-workers were summoned again, this time with evidence that felt less speculative, and one executive, previously cooperative, now appeared guarded, his answers clipped, his lawyer interjecting at every turn, and though no direct proof tied him to the siphoned funds, investigators uncovered that he had quietly resigned 6 months after the murder, relocating out of state, a move that at the time raised no eyebrows, but now shimmered with implication, and detectives flew out to question him. In a suburban home far removed from city noise. He denied everything with polished calm, insisting the victim was competent, loyal, unlikely to suspect internal fraud, yet when confronted with the hidden spreadsheet comments, his composure fractured for a heartbeat too long, and though that crack was not admissible in court, it lingered in the detective's mind like a fingerprint pressed into soft clay, not enough to convict, but enough to doubt. Meanwhile, the prepaid phone cluster yielded another thread. One device had briefly connected near a warehouse district along the East River, an area known in the early 2000s for off-the-books dealings, shell companies operating behind anonymous doors. And when investigators pulled property records, they discovered that a storage unit rented under a false name in 1999 had been abandoned days after the murder. Its contents auctioned off and scattered, yet the rental application contained a forged driver's license number that matched a pattern seen in other financial fraud cases of that era. The web widened, threads tangling across boroughs, across industries, from finance to shadow businesses that thrived in the cracks of regulation, and the once simple narrative of a man shot in a car mutated into something sprawling. Something that suggested he might have brushed against a network far more entrenched than a single rogue colleague, and that possibility chilled even seasoned detectives, because dismantling a network is infinitely harder than arresting one shooter. The family watched these developments with cautious hope, attending meetings where detectives laid out charts pinned with red string, maps dotted with cell tower pings, names circled and underlined, and for the first time in years there was movement, not closure, not justice, but motion, the sense that the case was breathing again rather than embalmed in archival boxes. Yet progress brought its own terror, because the more layers they peeled back, the clearer it became that the victim's final hours were not random, not chaotic, but orchestrated. A meeting arranged under false pretenses, a shooter who arrived prepared, who fired once and vanished into a city designed to swallow secrets, and the realization settled heavily. If this was tied to financial corruption, then others might have known, others might have stayed silent out of fear or complicity, and silence can be as lethal as any weapon. Anonymous emails began arriving at the cold case unit, vague warnings to stop digging, to let the past remain buried. Messages routed through encrypted servers overseas, impossible to trace definitively, yet unmistakably threatening, and though they contained no explicit violence, the implication was clear enough to tighten security protocols and remind everyone involved that reopening old wounds can provoke those who inflicted them. The detective who first reopened the file started noticing the same dark sedan parked near his apartment on consecutive nights, a detail he dismissed at first as paranoia fueled by long hours and grim photographs. But when the car vanished the moment he approached it, unease hardened into suspicion, echoing the old claim from the victim's college friend about being followed, and history seemed to loop back on itself in a pattern too precise to ignore. Still, without a direct link between any suspect and the trigger pull, prosecutors hesitated to act, evidence strong enough to suggest motive yet too thin to guarantee conviction. And so the case hovered in a liminal space between breakthrough and collapse, teetering on the edge of something monumental yet refusing to tip. By the 12th anniversary, the phrase, cold case, no longer felt accurate inside the unit. It felt volatile, alive with suppressed heat, because every new document uncovered hinted at deliberate concealment. Every digital trace suggested coordination, and the question that once centered on a lone shooter now expanded outward. Was the man outside that driver's window merely an instrument, the visible edge of a blade forged by others who never stepped into the streetlight? The city outside continued its relentless pace, taxis blurring past the same corner where it began, pedestrians unaware of the layers of history embedded in asphalt. But inside the precinct walls the investigation pressed forward with renewed urgency, driven by the belief that somewhere within those financial records, those prepaid phones, those abandoned storage units, lies a connective thread strong enough to pull the entire truth into daylight. And as detectives prepared subpoenas, re-interviewed witnesses, and mapped out a conspiracy that might stretch further than anyone anticipated, the sense grew sharper, heavier, almost electric. This case was never random, never simple, and whoever believed time would erase it underestimated the persistence of those determined to make the silence finally speak. The breakthrough did not arrive with sirens or flashing cameras. It arrived as a lab report, 23 pages of clinical language that made seasoned detectives sit down in stunned silence, because buried in the technical jargon was a sentence that changed everything. Touch DNA recovered from the inside frame of the driver's side door had produced a partial profile, and that partial profile matched a man already sitting in a federal correctional facility under an alias, convicted years earlier on charges that had nothing to do with murder and everything to do with fraud. His name, at least the one listed in the prison registry, was Daniel Varga, a Hungarian national who entered the United States in the late 1990s, vanished into a maze of shell corporations, and resurfaced in 2008 when federal investigators dismantled a sprawling financial scam that siphoned millions through offshore accounts. At the time of his arrest, he was described as disciplined, calculating, meticulous to the point of obsession, a man who left nothing to chance, and now his genetic trace sat quietly on a car door in a homicide from 2000, a ghost stepping into the light. Detectives from New York City flew to the federal facility without informing local media, without alerting anyone outside a tight circle, because if this connection held, the implications would ripple far beyond a single trigger pull. They entered the interview room with a thin folder and a thicker resolve, and when Varga walked in wearing a neutral expression that bordered on bored indifference, the air shifted, heavy, expectant, electric. He denied knowing the victim before the question fully formed, denied ever being on that block, denied owning a 9mm, denied even living in the city at the time, but when presented with the DNA report his composure flickered, not dramatically, not enough to shatter the facade, but enough to register that the past he believed erased had begun to reconstruct itself molecule by molecule. He leaned back, folded his hands, and asked for a lawyer. Background checks peeled back his history like layers of old paint, revealing a pattern that now felt ominously familiar: prepaid phones purchased under false identities, short-term storage units abandoned without explanation, small-scale financial manipulations that escalated into elaborate schemes. And in the timeline of his early years in the United States there were gaps, entire months unaccounted for in employment records, including the spring of 2000, when the victim was shot beneath that flickering street lamp. The cold case unit dug into Varga's associates, mapping out connections between his shell companies and the victim's firm, and there it was, a sliver of overlap, one subsidiary that had processed funds flagged in the hidden spreadsheet annotations, a corporate bridge so narrow it could be dismissed as coincidence, yet now illuminated by DNA it looked less like chance and more like convergence, as if two trajectories that once ran parallel had collided with lethal consequence. Former colleagues were questioned again, this time confronted with Varga's name, and one junior accountant, now a senior partner, went pale upon hearing it. He admitted that around the time of the murder there were whispers about external consultants advising on risk mitigation, a phrase vague enough to hide almost anything, and though he claimed no direct knowledge of wrongdoing, his voice trembled when he described a tense meeting in which the victim argued against approving certain transfers, insisting they could not withstand scrutiny. Investigators reconstructed that meeting from fragments of memory, imagining fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, spreadsheets projected on a screen, the victim's measured tone turning firm as he questioned irregularities, and somewhere in the periphery perhaps a man like Varga listening, calculating, assessing whether persuasion would suffice, or whether a more permanent solution would be required. It was speculation, yes, but speculation now tethered to genetic evidence that placed him physically at the crime scene. The defense moved quickly, filing motions to challenge the integrity of the DNA sample, arguing contamination, arguing degradation, arguing that a partial profile from a car door touched by countless hands over years could not definitively tie their client to a murder. Prosecutors countered with chain of custody documentation, an expert testimony explaining that the sample was preserved from 2000, sealed, untouched until reanalysis, a time capsule that refused to cooperate with the narrative of coincidence. Meanwhile, detectives pursued a darker possibility, that Varga was not the mastermind, but the intermediary, the man hired to intimidate or silence, and if that were true, then the financial web uncovered earlier might conceal individuals who never stepped near the car yet orchestrated the encounter from a distance. Subpoenas were issued for archived emails recovered from backup servers, and within encrypted exchanges between Varga and an executive at the victim's firm were coded references to finalizing the issue and ensuring stability before audit season, phrases innocuous on the surface yet chilling when read against the backdrop of a midnight shooting. The executive, long retired, was brought in for questioning under the glare of renewed suspicion. He maintained that the emails referred to routine consulting matters, that finalizing meant closing accounts, not lives, and yet when shown the timestamp of a message sent less than an hour before the victim's final phone call, his explanation faltered. a bead of sweat tracing down his temple as he insisted he had been home that night, asleep, unaware that a man he once supervised was bleeding out beneath a street lamp. Cell tower data from 2000, once too crude to pinpoint movement, was reprocessed using modern algorithms, narrowing signal triangulation to a radius small enough to place Varga's known prepaid device within 3 blocks of the crime scene at the estimated time of death. It was not a smoking gun, but it was a tightening net, digital and biological strands weaving together into something prosecutors believed could withstand a jury's scrutiny. Yet even as momentum built, a new complication surfaced. A witness who had never come forward before, a former dock worker from the warehouse district along the East River, contacted detectives claiming he saw 2 men arguing near a dark sedan that night, one inside the vehicle, one leaning through the window, and behind them another figure standing several yards away, watching, a silhouette that never approached yet never left. The description was vague, but it suggested coordination, a lookout. Perhaps, an extra pair of eyes ensuring the act unfolded without interruption. If there were 2 or 3, then the narrative expanded again, implicating a broader conspiracy, and investigators cross-referenced Varga's known associates from his fraud case with travel records from early 2000, identifying one accomplice who had entered the country on a short-term visa that spring and departed abruptly days after the murder. Attempts to locate him overseas met bureaucratic resistance. Foreign authorities slow to respond, files lost in translation, and the sense grew that this case was not merely about justice delayed, but about networks that thrived in shadows stretching across borders. The victim's family, informed of the DNA match, reacted with a surge of cautious hope tempered by years of disappointment. They attended hearings where Varga appeared via video link, his face impassive, eyes betraying nothing, and for them the sight was both vindication and torment, because seeing a possible killer breathe calmly behind prison glass did not equate to understanding why their son never came home. As pre-trial battles intensified, media outlets rediscovered the story, headlines flashing phrases like "cold case breakthrough" and "DNA links inmate to 2000 slaying," reigniting public fascination, but inside the investigation room the mood was less triumphant and more vigilant, because seasoned detectives know that a single suspect does not automatically equal the full truth, and every new revelation seemed to expose deeper layers rather than seal them shut. Then came the final shock of that year. Financial records obtained through international cooperation revealed that days after the murder, a significant sum was transferred from an offshore account tied to the executive's network into a shell company later associated with Varga, labeled cryptically as consulting completion fee, and though defense attorneys insisted it corresponded to legitimate services rendered, the timing carved a silhouette of motive too stark to ignore. The question that once echoed in emptiness, who stood outside that driver's window, now had a name attached, a face behind glass, but as prosecutors prepared to formalize charges, another question loomed larger, darker, more unsettling. Was Daniel Varga the hand that pulled the trigger, or merely the blade wielded by others whose fingerprints remained just out of reach? And if the latter, how many layers of silence would need to be stripped away before the entire architecture of that midnight execution finally collapsed into the open? The indictment landed like a thunderclap, unsealed on a gray morning when rain slicked the streets of New York City and reporters clustered outside the courthouse clutching microphones. The words, 2000 cold case murder, splashed across every chyron before noon, and Daniel Varga was formally charged with second-degree murder, conspiracy, and weapons violations. A man once defined by financial fraud now staring down the possibility of life behind bars for a bullet fired 23 years earlier. Beneath a trembling street lamp, he was transferred from federal custody to a local detention center, shackled, silent, eyes forward, and when cameras caught his face for the first time in connection with the killing, the image traveled fast, igniting talk shows and online forums, strangers dissecting his expression as if guilt could be measured in pixels. Inside interrogation rooms, however, the mood was colder, more methodical, because detectives understood that charging him was only the beginning, not the end. Prosecutors laid out their case in stark lines. Touch DNA on the car door, prepaid phones clustered around the crime scene, encrypted emails hinting at finalizing the issue, a suspicious transfer labeled consulting completion feed days after the murder, and cell tower triangulation placing his device within blocks of the victim's final location. It was a lattice of circumstantial and scientific evidence woven tight enough to hold weight, yet still missing one crucial element, an unambiguous confession or eyewitness who could point to him and say, "That's the man who leaned into the window and pulled the trigger." The defense struck back immediately, filing motions to suppress the DNA match, arguing that advances in technology had reinterpreted degraded samples beyond their original limitations, that partial profiles can mislead, that statistical probabilities do not equal certainty. They painted a portrait of overzealous investigators desperate to close a headline case, retrofitting data to match a convenient villain, and in court their words echoed sharply, reminding everyone how fragile even a reopened case can be. Behind the scenes, detectives intensified pressure on the executive, whose name threaded through emails and offshore transfers. He was no longer merely a person of interest, he was a potential co-conspirator, and subpoenas demanded every archived communication, every travel record, every banking detail from the year 2000, and as forensic accountants reconstructed financial flows across borders, they uncovered layered shell entities designed to obscure ownership so thoroughly that tracing a single dollar felt like chasing smoke through a maze. A breakthrough came not from a bank, but from a former assistant who had worked for the executive 2 decades earlier, now retired and living quietly upstate. She agreed to speak under immunity, and in a trembling voice she described a late-night call she overheard in the office days before the murder, the executive pacing, agitated, repeating the phrase, "He won't back down," followed by a cryptic assurance to the person on the other end that, "It will be handled." At the time she dismissed it as corporate drama, but when news of the arrest surfaced years later, the memory resurfaced with chilling clarity. Investigators confronted the executive with this account, and for the first time his composure fractured openly. He denied ordering harm, denied even implying violence, insisting handled referred to legal action, internal discipline, routine corporate damage control, yet his timeline wavered under scrutiny, inconsistencies surfacing about where he was that night, who he spoke to, how long certain calls lasted, and each small crack in his narrative widened the possibility that the murder was not an isolated act, but the violent endpoint of financial panic. Meanwhile, prosecutors pursued the dock worker, who claimed to see a second figure standing several yards away. During the confrontation, placed under oath before a grand jury, he repeated his story, describing the silhouette as taller, broader than the man leaning into the car. Someone who never stepped forward yet radiated authority, and though he could not identify faces after so many years, his testimony introduced the specter of coordination, reinforcing the theory that the shooter may not have acted alone. Defense attorneys seized on the vagueness, calling it unreliable memory distorted by time and media coverage, and they were not wrong that 2 decades can warp recollection, but detectives countered by matching the dock workers' shift records to confirm he was indeed near the warehouse district that night, his presence not imagined but documented, and in cold cases even partial corroboration can tip the scale from improbable to plausible. As pre-trial hearings unfolded, another twist emerged. Forensic review of the victim's laptop, preserved in evidence storage since 2000, uncovered a draft email never sent, addressed to an unnamed recipient with the subject line urgent, irregular transfers, the body text incomplete, but clear in tone, stating that he had uncovered systematic manipulation and would not sign off without independent review. The timestamp placed the draft hours before his final dinner, hours before the ghost phone call, a digital echo of confrontation that never reached its destination. This unsent message tightened the motive, suggesting the victim intended to escalate concerns beyond internal channels, perhaps to regulators, perhaps to law enforcement, and if so, the stakes for those involved would have soared from embarrassment to criminal exposure, transforming a financial discrepancy into a catalyst for lethal silence. Public reaction intensified as details spilled into the press. Candlelight vigils revisiting the same sidewalk where blood once dried, neighbors who had long since moved returning to watch proceedings unfold on courthouse steps, and the phrase, cold case cracked, repeated so often it began to sound definitive, triumphant. Yet inside the prosecution team there was caution, because cracked does not mean complete, and conviction is never guaranteed. Then, just as momentum seemed unstoppable, Varga made an unexpected move. Through his attorney he offered to provide information in exchange for a reduced sentence, not a confession exactly, but cooperation, a suggestion that he possessed knowledge extending beyond his own involvement. The proposal ignited fierce debate within the district attorney's office, weighing the promise of exposing a broader conspiracy against the moral cost of bargaining with a man accused of murder. Negotiations unfolded in guarded conference rooms, transcripts sealed, and though no details were released publicly, leaks hinted that Varga claimed he was hired to resolve a liability, that he never intended to kill, that the plan was intimidation gone wrong, and that the true architect of the scheme occupied a higher rung in the corporate hierarchy, someone who never touched the car door, never fired a weapon, yet set events in motion with calculated detachment. The executive's legal team responded aggressively, denouncing any suggestion of conspiracy as self-serving fabrication from a desperate defendant, and the courtroom atmosphere grew volatile. A chess match of accusations and denials, each side maneuvering for leverage while the victim's family watched, caught between hope for full truth and fear that plea deals might dilute justice. Outside, the city pulsed as always, traffic roaring past that same corner without pause. Yet for those immersed in the case the past felt startlingly present, as if the year 2000 had folded into the present tense, secrets once thought buried clawing upward through layers of time. And as prosecutors weighed whether to accept cooperation, as detectives revisited every scrap of evidence in light of Varga's hints, one reality crystallized with unsettling clarity: the shot fired under that street lamp may have come from one man's hand, but the decision to silence the victim might have been made long before that night, in boardrooms far removed from asphalt and blood. The question now was no longer simply who pulled the trigger, but who decided that a man's refusal to sign off on fraudulent transfers warranted permanent removal, and whether the justice system, 2 decades late yet fiercely determined, could untangle a conspiracy sophisticated enough to hide behind spreadsheets and shell companies while leaving a body cooling in the dark. And as the next hearing date approached, tension thickened across courtrooms and newsrooms alike, because the case once labeled cold was burning hotter than ever, threatening to scorch not only the accused shooter, but anyone who mistook financial crime for a game without consequences. The cooperation deal was struck in silence, sealed behind closed doors where fluorescent lights hummed and legal pads filled with careful handwriting, and when Daniel Varga finally agreed to speak without ambiguity, the room felt smaller, thinner, because this was the moment investigators had chased for 23 years, the moment the man with DNA on the car door would either dismantle the case or detonate it. He did not begin with an apology. He began with a correction. It wasn't supposed to be a murder, he said, voice level, accent faint, but present, hands folded on the metal table as if discussing quarterly projections instead of a human life. Detectives let the silence stretch. According to Varga, he was contacted in early 2000 by an intermediary tied to the victim's firm, a risk consultant, who specialized in discrete problem-solving when internal matters threatened external exposure. Varga described meetings in rented office spaces, conversations layered in euphemism, containment, stability, prevent escalation, phrases that masked the underlying fear that a junior analyst had discovered irregular transfers large enough to trigger federal scrutiny. The victim, he claimed, refused to sign compliance documents, refused to ignore discrepancies, and worse, indicated he might go outside the company if concerns were not addressed. In financial circles built on leverage and illusion, that kind of integrity can be combustible. Varga admitted purchasing the prepaid phones, admitted surveilling the victim's apartment, mapping his routine, identifying patterns, weaknesses, opportunities. He described the late-night call placed minutes before the shooting as a final attempt to arrange a private meeting framed as clarification, a chance to talk it through. And when the victim agreed to pull over on a quiet block to discuss matters face-to-face, the plan, he insisted, was intimidation. But intimidation, like fire, can spread. He said there were 2 others present that night, one acting as lookout several yards back, another waiting in a vehicle around the corner. He refused to provide names initially, referring to them only as insurance, men hired to ensure the conversation did not spiral beyond control. When detectives pressed him on the weapon, he admitted bringing the 9mm as leverage, something visible enough to frighten, but not necessarily to fire. He claimed the argument escalated when the victim threatened to contact authorities the next morning, that tempers flared, that a struggle at the window led to a single shot discharged at close range. A mistake irreversible the moment it echoed off brick and asphalt. Investigators listened without interruption, aware that every word required corroboration, that a confession shaped to minimize intent can be as strategic as silence. Still, details in his account aligned with evidence long sealed in binders. The angle of the bullet, the proximity suggested by stippling, the dockworker's description of a second figure watching from a distance. When asked who authorized the operation, Varga's composure shifted for the first time. He did not name the executive outright. Instead, he described board-level anxiety, described a directive relayed through layers to avoid direct traceability, described assurances that the problem would resolve quietly, and when detectives confronted him with the offshore transfer labeled consulting completion fee, he acknowledged receiving payment days after the murder, though he insisted it was compensation for broader advisory services, not a bounty. Prosecutors now faced a volatile equation, a defendant admitting presence and confrontation, but framing the shooting as unintended escalation, and implicating unnamed higher powers without providing the clean, courtroom-ready clarity required for indictment. The deal hinged on names, on verifiable links, on proof that extended beyond self-preservation. Meanwhile, the retired executive, long shielded by lawyers and carefully worded denials, felt the ground shift beneath him as whispers of Varga's cooperation reached his legal team. He appeared again before investigators, posture rigid, tone sharpened, categorically denying any directive to harm the victim, insisting corporate discussions never crossed into violence. But digital forensics had progressed further. Encrypted emails once partially recovered were now fully reconstructed through advanced decryption methods, revealing a thread sent 48 hours before the murder, in which the executive wrote, "We cannot afford exposure at this stage. Ensure compliance by any means necessary," a phrase defensible in abstraction, yet damning in context. The phrase became the center of argument, the pivot on which conspiracy might turn. Defense counsel argued it referred to legal compliance, internal audits, nothing more. Prosecutors countered that paired with Varga's testimony and the financial transfer, it formed a chain of intent stretching from boardroom to bullet. Public interest reignited with ferocity, headlines splashing across screens in New York City, commentators debating whether white-collar fear had metastasized into street-level violence, candlelight vigils returning once more to the corner where it began, the street lamp now replaced yet symbolically unchanged. But amid the spectacle, a quieter revelation surfaced. The unsent draft email recovered from the victim's laptop was not the only unfinished message. Forensic technicians uncovered fragments of deleted notes stored in temporary memory files, one reading simply, "If anything happens to me," followed by a list of account numbers and initials. It suggested foresight, the dawning realization that he was stepping into dangerous territory, that resistance carried risk. Detectives cross-referenced those account numbers with offshore entities tied to the executive's network and Varga's shell companies, solidifying the financial motive with greater precision. This was no abstract dispute. It was millions at stake, reputations poised to collapse, potential indictments looming if exposure occurred. As negotiations with Varga continued, he finally provided names of the two accomplices present that night, one matching the dockworker's description of the distant silhouette. Both had since left the country, one deceased under ambiguous circumstances abroad, the other residing in Eastern Europe under a changed identity. International warrants were drafted, but jurisdictional hurdles loomed, cooperation from foreign governments uncertain, and the realization settled in that while the shooter sat in custody, the broader network might remain partially out of reach. The victim's family attended a closed-door briefing where prosecutors outlined the evolving theory, a corporate fraud threatened by internal dissent, a calculated plan to intimidate, the confrontation spiraling into fatality, payments disguised as consulting fees, and layers of deniability engineered to protect those at the top. For them, the knowledge was both devastating and clarifying. Their son had not been random collateral in urban chaos. He had been targeted because he refused to bend. In court, Varga formally entered a plea agreement admitting to manslaughter and conspiracy, stopping short of intentional murder, his testimony to be used in potential proceedings against higher-level conspirators. The decision sparked controversy, some calling it compromise, others calling it strategic necessity in pursuit of greater accountability. The executive, now facing mounting evidence and the possibility of indictment, maintained innocence publicly, yet privately his legal defenses shifted from outright denial to technical argument, challenging interpretations, contesting intent, distancing language from action. The cold case that once seemed frozen in time now moved with volatile speed, hearings scheduled, subpoenas expanded, international cooperation requested, yet beneath the procedural momentum lingered a haunting truth. Even with a confession, even with financial trails illuminated, the precise moment the gun fired remained clouded by competing narratives. Was it panic? Was it escalation? Was it always inevitable? On the anniversary of the murder, the family returned once more to that quiet block in New York City, no longer asking who pulled the trigger, but grappling with a deeper question about how ambition, fear, and greed can converge into irreversible violence. The street lamp cast its steady glow over asphalt that no longer bore stains, yet memory persisted, sharper now, more defined. And as prosecutors prepared the next phase, deciding whether evidence sufficed to charge the executive with conspiracy to commit murder, the city held its breath, aware that justice delayed had not been justice denied, yet also aware that truth, once exposed, rarely confines itself to a single courtroom, and that the full reckoning of what happened in 2000 might still send shockwaves far beyond one man's cell and one corporation's boardroom. The conspiracy indictment was handed down in early autumn, the air sharp, the sky over New York City a hard, metallic blue that seemed almost theatrical against the gravity of the charges, and when the retired executive was escorted into federal court flanked by attorneys who once projected invincibility, cameras flashed like lightning, the headline no longer whispering about a cold case, but roaring about corporate conspiracy tied to a midnight killing. He was charged not with pulling a trigger, but with orchestrating a campaign of intimidation that foreseeably resulted in death, a legal theory built carefully from Varga's testimony, encrypted emails, offshore transfers, and reconstructed timelines that placed escalating panic at the center of the narrative. Prosecutors argued that when he wrote "ensure compliance by any means necessary," he ignited a chain reaction he knew could spiral into violence. The defense moved to sever the cases, to distance their client from Varga's plea, to portray the confessed participant as a self-serving criminal seeking leniency, and for weeks motions flew back and forth, dense with legal precedent and technical objections, while the public absorbed the spectacle as if it was serialized drama rather than a reckoning decades in the making. Behind the courtroom choreography, detectives continued tightening loose threads. The second accomplice identified by Varga, the lookout described by the dock worker, had died in a car crash overseas 5 years earlier, a detail that closed one door permanently yet opened another question about coincidence. The third man, the driver waiting around the corner, remained alive under a modified identity in Eastern Europe, and through coordinated efforts with international authorities, a provisional arrest request was filed, fragile but persistent. Financial analysts reconstructed the fraud in full scope, revealing that the irregular transfers the victim uncovered were part of a layered embezzlement scheme siphoning millions through shell corporations into offshore havens, funds masked as consulting fees, asset reallocations, risk adjustments, terminology that cloaked theft in corporate respectability. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that exposure would have triggered regulatory investigations capable of dismantling careers and possibly sending multiple executives to prison. The prosecution's narrative crystallized. Fear of collapse drove desperation, desperation outsourced to intimidation, intimidation escalated under pressure. One gunshot later, a problem was silenced. Yet the defense countered with a simpler, colder assertion. Words in emails are not bullets, fear of audit is not conspiracy to kill, and no document existed explicitly ordering harm. They painted their client as negligent in oversight perhaps, ethically compromised even, but not a mastermind of murder. Then a new fracture appeared. A forensic accountant reviewing archived call logs noticed a call placed from the executive's office landline to a number registered to Varga's intermediary less than 20 minutes after the shooting occurred. The timestamp aligned with emergency dispatch records, meaning the call was made after the fatal shot, but before news could have spread publicly. When confronted, the executive claimed he was unaware of the incident at that moment, that the call concerned unrelated financial matters, yet prosecutors emphasized the improbability. How could he discuss routine business with a consultant minutes after the consultant had been involved in a fatal confrontation tied to their shared corporate anxiety? The timing became a focal point, a crack widening into something more structural. Varga, under oath, testified that he informed the intermediary immediately after the shot, that panic replaced strategy, that instructions were given to disappear, clean up, cut contact, and that he never again communicated directly with the executive. This testimony, though self-serving, aligned with the abrupt cessation of certain email threads and the sudden offshore transfer labeled as consulting completion. Courtrooms filled daily, journalists scribbling notes as legal teams sparred over admissibility, intent, foreseeability. The victim's family sat through every session, absorbing language that reduced a life to evidence exhibits and statutory definitions, yet clinging to the notion that clarity, however technical, equaled acknowledgement. Outside, the block where it happened transformed into a symbol, documentaries filming reenactments under a newly installed street lamp, neighbors recounting where they stood that night, how the sirens sounded, how the memory never fully dissolved. Midway through proceedings, the surviving overseas accomplice was detained pending extradition, a development that injected new volatility into the case. If he corroborated Varga's account, the conspiracy theory would solidify, but if he contradicted it, doubt would seep back in, eroding the prosecution's momentum. From a holding facility abroad, through diplomatic channels, he issued a preliminary statement denying knowledge of any plan to kill, admitting presence in the city in 2000 but framing his role as logistical support for business negotiations, language eerily similar to the euphemisms that had masked so much already. Whether this was coordinated defense or fractured loyalty remained unclear. As the trial date approached, plea negotiations surfaced quietly. The executive's attorneys explored options short of full admission, perhaps acknowledging obstruction, perhaps admitting to financial misconduct while rejecting murder conspiracy, yet prosecutors signaled unwillingness to dilute the gravity of what they believed evidence demonstrated, that a chain of command, however indirect, culminated in irreversible violence. In closing pretrial arguments, the judge addressed the core question that had haunted the case from the beginning: does instructing someone to ensure compliance by any means necessary in the face of criminal exposure create foreseeable risk of deadly force? It was a question not only legal, but moral, one that rippled beyond the confines of the courtroom into corporate boardrooms and risk management seminars across the city. The trial commenced with meticulous presentation. Jurors viewed reconstructed cell tower maps, watched experts explain touch DNA amplification, listened to Varga recount the confrontation in chillingly measured tones. They heard the dock worker describe the silhouette standing watch, heard the retired assistant recount the phrase, "he won't back down," heard accountants trace money flows like arteries feeding a hidden heart of corruption. The defense dismantled each element methodically, highlighting inconsistencies, emphasizing absence of direct order, reminding jurors that speculation cannot substitute for proof beyond reasonable doubt. Days turned into weeks, tension coiling tighter. Then, during cross-examination, a pivotal exchange unfolded. Asked why he accepted payment after the shooting if the death was accidental, Varga paused longer than before and replied, "Because they needed silence, and I needed assurance." The courtroom stilled. Assurance of what? Protection, he said. The implication hung heavy, that those at the top possessed influence capable of shielding participants from scrutiny, that silence was purchased not only to conceal fraud, but to contain fallout from violence. In rebuttal, prosecutors presented internal corporate memos from weeks after the murder instructing staff to avoid discussing the victim's departure, to attribute his absence to personal leave, evidence of coordinated narrative management that felt less like coincidence and more like containment strategy. As deliberations began, the city once again held its breath. The cold case once shelved as unsolvable had evolved into a sprawling examination of power, fear, and consequence, and while one man had admitted presence at the fatal window, the broader question rested with 12 jurors now weighing whether corporate language, financial motive, and coordinated silence amounted to criminal conspiracy. Whatever verdict emerged, the myth of randomness had been shattered. The man under the street lamp had not been a casualty of chance. He had been a threat. And as the jury doors closed, sealing inside them years of evidence and decades of grief, the final outcome loomed not only as judgment on individuals, but as a reckoning for a system that once believed it could bury its darkest decisions beneath spreadsheets and shadows, only to discover that time, technology, and relentless persistence would eventually drag them back into the light. The jury deliberated for 6 days. 6 days of sealed doors, muted hallways, reporters whispering into cameras outside the courthouse in New York City. 6 days where every tick of the clock felt amplified, every passing hour stretching the tension tighter across a city that had waited 23 years for a reckoning. Inside the jury room, exhibits were spread across a long table like pieces of a fractured timeline: cell tower maps, DNA probability charts, printed emails with phrases highlighted in yellow, bank transfer summaries stamped with offshore routing codes. At the center of it all, a single photograph: the victim's car under the old street lamp, driver's door open, frozen in time. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom filled beyond capacity, air thick, wooden benches creaking under the weight of anticipation. Daniel Varga, already bound by his plea to manslaughter and conspiracy, sat expressionless, hands clasped, eyes lowered. The retired executive stood beside his attorneys, posture rigid but jaw tight. The foreperson rose. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. The word struck like a hammer. A collective exhale rippled through the gallery, sharp, almost disbelieving. On related financial fraud and obstruction counts, guilty. The executive's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, shoulders dipping, eyes blinking rapidly, as if recalibrating a reality he had long assumed would never materialize. The legal threshold had been crossed. The jury had decided that corporate language, financial motive, and calculated silence had coalesced into criminal intent. Sentencing would come later. But the narrative had shifted permanently. Outside, headlines erupted: cold case conspiracy confirmed, boardroom to bloodshed, 23-year silence shattered. Yet inside the prosecution team, celebration was restrained. Because even with the verdict, even with the guilty finding, questions remained, about the second accomplice deceased overseas, about the third man awaiting extradition, about how many others had known fragments and chosen silence. In the weeks that followed, the overseas accomplice was formally extradited, escorted into federal custody under heavy guard. Unlike Varga, he refused cooperation. He denied the shooting, denied foreknowledge, denied conspiracy. He admitted only to facilitating logistics, renting vehicles, scouting locations, arranging prepaid phones. His defense rested on the claim that he believed he was assisting in a business negotiation, nothing more. Prosecutors countered with the dock workers' testimony placing him at the scene, with financial transfers routed through accounts linked to his alias, with encrypted chat logs recovered from a defunct server indicating urgency the night of the murder. But without DNA tying him physically to the car door, the case against him felt less airtight. It was a reminder that even when one layer collapses, others can remain stubbornly intact. During sentencing, the victim's mother addressed the court. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke of birthdays missed, of an empty chair at holidays, of the slow erosion of certainty over 2 decades. She did not speak about revenge. She spoke about truth. You tried to bury him in paperwork, she said, looking directly at the executive. But he was a person. The judge imposed a lengthy sentence, decades in federal prison for the executive, additional years for Varga beyond his plea arrangement. The courtroom absorbed the finality in heavy silence. Yet outside the courthouse, the street where it began remained unchanged in structure, but altered in meaning. The lamp had been replaced years ago, brighter now, lead instead of flickering sodium, but the symbolism lingered. The block had become shorthand for something larger, proof that power does not guarantee invisibility, that time does not dissolve responsibility. Still, the third accomplice's trial loomed, and uncertainty hovered like low fog. If he were acquitted, would it fracture the narrative? If convicted, would it confirm the full architecture of conspiracy? During his proceedings, defense attorneys hammered one central point. There was no explicit instruction to kill. They portrayed the shooting as an unpredictable escalation, by Varga alone, a rogue act beyond the scope of any agreed intimidation. Prosecutors returned to the phrase that had defined the case, ensure compliance by any means necessary, arguing that when men with resources and influence outsource pressure to individuals known for coercive tactics, lethal outcomes become foreseeable. The jury in this second trial deliberated less time. Their verdict: guilty on conspiracy, not guilty on intentional homicide. A split acknowledgement. He had participated in the pressure campaign. But the final trigger, in their view, belonged to Varga. Legal analysts debated the nuance endlessly. But for the family, the distinction felt secondary. The architecture had been exposed. The chain of fear, greed, and decision-making had been mapped. Years later, investigative reports revealed regulatory reforms influenced quietly by the case, stricter oversight of consulting arrangements, tighter audit protections for whistleblowers. Corporate seminars referenced the tragedy as a cautionary tale, though often without naming the victim. And yet, for all the institutional ripple effects, the emotional epicenter remained that midnight in 2000. Because beneath legal theories and financial schematics lies a simpler truth. A man discovered something he believed was wrong. He refused to sign. He intended to escalate. And in response, others chose intimidation over accountability. The confrontation at the car window may have spiraled in seconds, but the conditions for it were engineered over weeks of fear and calculation. In the years following the final conviction, the block grew quieter. New tenants moved in unaware of its history. Children rode bicycles past the curb where evidence markers once stood. The city, relentless as ever, absorbed the story into its vast archive of crime and consequence. But every anniversary, a small group still gathers beneath the steady glow of the street lamp in New York City. No cameras now. No headlines. Just memory. They stand in silence not because the case remains unsolved, it no longer does, but because resolution does not erase impact. Justice, even delayed by decades, carries weight. And in that weight lingers a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous trigger is not a finger on steel, but a sentence typed in an office far removed from the sound of the shot, a decision made in fear that sets into motion a chain no one can fully control. The cold case was cracked. The conspiracy exposed. The architects convicted. Yet the echo of that single gunshot still vibrates softly through the city's conscience, a warning etched into asphalt and memory alike, proof that silence can be purchased for a time, but truth, patient and persistent, eventually forces its way back into the light. Years passed after the convictions, but the story refused to fade. Because closure in a courtroom does not always silence the deeper questions that linger in shadows. The case had been labeled solved. The headlines had moved on. Sentences were handed down. Appeals were filed and denied. And yet, inside the cold case unit in New York City, one detective kept the original photograph pinned above his desk, the car, the open door, the street lamp humming over wet pavement. Something about it still felt unfinished. It began with a routine evidence audit. Every few years, long-term evidence storage is reviewed, catalogued, retested, preserved. Advances in forensic science never stop, and what once seemed definitive can shift under new analysis. During a re-examination of ballistic material from the 2000 scene, a junior forensic analyst noticed something microscopic, yet unsettling. The barrel markings on the recovered bullet showed faint double-pattern striations inconsistent with a single weapon discharge. It suggested the gun may have been modified more extensively than previously understood, or that the bullet had passed through an intermediate surface before entering the victim. That detail had never been fully explored. If true, it could mean the shot was not fired at the exact angle prosecutors had argued during trial. The finding did not exonerate anyone. But it introduced doubt into the precise mechanics of that fatal second. The detective reopened the autopsy diagrams, cross-referencing trajectory with vehicle positioning. The entry wound indicated proximity, yes, but the new ballistic interpretation implied a slight deviation in angle, subtle, but measurable. Was the shooter standing exactly where Varga claimed? Or had he been positioned differently? And if differently, why did that matter? Because Varga's plea agreement hinged on his account of an escalating struggle at the window. If the physical evidence no longer perfectly aligned, the narrative required scrutiny. Prosecutors were notified. Quietly. No press release. No announcement. Internally, concern spread, not panic, but vigilance. If a defense appeal seized upon this nuance, it could complicate proceedings, reopen arguments, perhaps even trigger evidentiary hearings. At the same time, the surviving accomplice filed an appeal based on ineffective counsel, arguing that forensic inconsistencies were not fully explored during his trial. The case, once thought sealed, began to tremble again at its edges. Meanwhile, an investigative journalist revisiting the story uncovered something that reignited public intrigue. An internal memo from the victim's firm, dated 3 days after the murder, recently released through a civil discovery request. In it, a senior board member, not the convicted executive, wrote, "We must ensure no further internal disruptions surface. Audit exposure at this stage would be catastrophic." That board member had never been charged. Never indicted. Never formally implicated. Because evidence tying him directly to operational decisions remained circumstantial. But the memo's language mirrored earlier phrases presented in court. Ensure. Exposure. Catastrophic. Words that seemed to float above violence without touching it directly. The journalist's report questioned whether the conspiracy extended even further than proven in court. Whether the convicted executive had acted alone in his directives, or whether pressure cascaded downward from even higher levels. Public interest flickered back to life. Talk radio debated whether justice had been partial. True crime forums dissected ballistic diagrams. Documentaries re-aired. And in the midst of renewed attention, a retired federal investigator came forward with a startling claim. In early 2001, months after the murder, an anonymous tip had been submitted to a financial regulatory agency outlining the embezzlement scheme in precise detail, but it was never pursued. The tip had been archived. Ignored. Lost in bureaucratic backlog. The implication was explosive. If regulators had acted swiftly in 2001, could the conspiracy have unraveled earlier? Could justice have arrived before decades passed? The agency declined to comment publicly, citing internal review. But the revelation reinforced a chilling possibility that systems designed to detect corruption sometimes fail quietly, allowing damage to calcify into tragedy. Back in evidence storage, the forensic team completed additional testing on trace fibers recovered from the vehicle's interior. One fiber, previously dismissed as common upholstery contamination, was matched to a high-end European overcoat brand rarely sold in the United States in 2000. Purchase records traced limited shipments to specialty retailers. One such retailer had recorded a purchase under a corporate credit account linked, not to the convicted executive, but to the uncharged board member referenced in the newly surfaced memo. The timeline aligned within weeks of the murder. Circumstantial. Suggestive. But not definitive. The detective who never removed the photograph from his wall stared at the data long into the night. Was it coincidence? Or the final missing fragment? Reopening prosecution against another high-ranking corporate figure would require extraordinary proof, far beyond fibers and mirrored language. And yet, history had shown that dismissing fragments can allow truth to remain buried. The victim's family was informed of the new developments cautiously. They had endured the long arc of investigation, trial, sentencing. They had stood in courtrooms, given statements, faced the men responsible. The idea that the web might extend further was both exhausting and galvanizing. They did not demand new arrests. They asked only one question: is there more? In response, a small internal task force was assembled. Not a public reopening. Not a formal reinvestigation. A quiet review. They revisited board meeting minutes from 1999 and 2000, noting heightened tension around regulatory audits. They re-examined travel records for board members during the week of the murder. One name appeared in proximity to the city that night, documented at a hotel less than 10 blocks from the crime scene. No direct link placed him on the block. No witness identified him. But the coincidence deepened unease. Meanwhile, Varga, now years into his sentence, learned of the renewed scrutiny through his attorney. He requested a meeting. This time, his demeanor had shifted, less guarded, more reflective. He stated calmly that while the executive conveyed urgency, the tone of the directive had originated from board discussions he was never privy to directly. He implied hierarchy. Pressure flowing downward. Fear intensifying at each level. But when pressed for specifics, names, explicit instructions, he demurred. No one says the word kill, he said. They say resolve. The ambiguity lingered. The city outside remained indifferent. Traffic roared. Seasons turned. But beneath the surface, the idea that the conspiracy might have been broader than proven unsettled those who had believed the verdict marked an endpoint. Cold cases are rarely neat. Even when convictions land. Even when sentences are imposed. Because truth does not always align perfectly with what can be proven in court. And as forensic science continued to evolve, as archived emails yielded metadata once inaccessible, as overlooked fibers and forgotten memos resurfaced, one reality became undeniable. The gunshot under that street lamp may have concluded one man's life. But the full architecture of why it happened, who felt fear, who applied pressure, who chose silence, might still stretch further into shadow than anyone publicly acknowledged. The case was cracked. But the story was not static. It was layered. Complex. Alive in the margins. And somewhere in those margins, perhaps in a boardroom conversation never recorded, perhaps in a memo never saved, perhaps in a decision made without fingerprints, lies a final truth that has yet to fully step into the light. The phone call came just after midnight, thin and metallic, a dispatcher's voice slicing through the humid August air of 2000. A possible assault. Female victim. Alley off West 46th Street. Units responded without urgency at first. Another late-night disturbance in a city that had seen worse. But when the patrol car headlights cut across the brick walls and illuminated the narrow corridor between dumpsters and rusted fire escapes, the tone shifted. There was no movement. No sound. Just a body, half-shadowed, one shoe missing, hair fanned across wet concrete like spilled ink. This was the moment the city would later call a cold case. But that night, it was just another crime scene under flickering sodium lights in New York City, a place that never truly sleeps, only waits. Detectives sealed the alley by 1:12 a.m. Yellow tape fluttered against brick. Neighbors leaned out from windows 3 floors up, their silhouettes framed by television glow. The victim was identified within hours, 24 years old, a graduate student, part-time bartender. She had left her shift at 11:37 p.m., walked 3 blocks toward the subway, and vanished into the dark between buildings. No wallet missing. No obvious signs of robbery. A single deep wound. Clean. Precise. Personal. By dawn, the headlines had already begun forming in newsrooms across Manhattan. Young woman slain in Midtown Alley. Mysterious killing stuns community. The words felt routine, almost interchangeable with yesterday's tragedy. But something about the stillness of that alley lingered with the first responders. No defensive chaos. No scattered belongings. It looked controlled. Deliberate. The medical examiner's preliminary report landed before noon. Time of death, approximately midnight. Cause, a single stab wound to the chest, angled downward. The blade had pierced between ribs, straight into the heart. Whoever did this knew exactly where to strike. Detectives canvassed the block. A doorman remembered a man pacing near the corner around 11:20 p.m., tall, dark jacket, baseball cap pulled low. A delivery driver thought he heard raised voices, but couldn't distinguish words. One resident insisted she saw a couple arguing, but she admitted she hadn't been wearing her glasses. The first 48 hours blurred into an avalanche of tips. Ex-boyfriend in Queens. Regular bar patron with a temper. A co-worker who left early that night. Each lead chased, each alibi checked. Nothing stuck. Surveillance cameras were sparse in 2000, grainy and unreliable. One black and white tape from a deli across the street captured a shadow moving quickly at 11:58 p.m., but the image was too distorted to identify a face. Days turned into weeks. The case file thickened, then slowed. Detectives leaned on the boyfriend hard. He had motive, they said. Recent argument. Jealousy. But phone records placed him in Brooklyn at the time of the murder, backed by a toll receipt and 3 witnesses at a late-night poker game. Attention shifted to a stranger theory. Random attack. Crime of opportunity. Yet the wound's precision contradicted randomness. This wasn't a frenzied mugging. It was surgical. A partial fingerprint lifted from a metal dumpster lid created a flicker of hope. It didn't match anyone in the system. Not a known offender. Not a local. It sat in the database like a ghost, searchable but silent. The family held a vigil 2 weeks later. Candles lined the sidewalk. Her mother's voice cracked as she addressed reporters, asking for answers, asking for anyone who knew something to come forward. Community leaders promised justice. The mayor stood before cameras, vowing that the NYPD would not let this case grow cold. But cold cases don't announce their arrival. They settle slowly, like dust. By 2002, the detective originally assigned had transferred to another division. The file moved to a shelf, then to a box. DNA swabs collected from under the victim's fingernails were preserved, carefully labeled, stored in a climate-controlled evidence room. Technology at the time offered limited analysis. The sample was partial. Degraded. Not enough for a confident match. The city changed. New buildings rose where old warehouses once stood. Security cameras multiplied. But the alley remained the same, brick, narrow, echoing with footsteps that had nothing to do with murder anymore. In 2005, a new detective reopened the file during a departmental review of unsolved homicides from the early 2000s. He read every page. Interview transcripts. Autopsy details. Crime scene photos that still carried the chill of that August night. He noticed something small, almost overlooked. The downward angle of the wound suggested the attacker was taller than the victim by several inches. The doorman's recollection of a tall man in a dark jacket resurfaced in his mind. They tracked down the doorman, now retired in Florida. His memory had faded, details blurred by time. Tall, he repeated over the phone. Maybe 6 feet. Could have been anyone. Another lead surfaced briefly. A man arrested in 2004 for a similar stabbing in another borough. Same age range of victim. Same late-night setting. Detectives compared case notes, but the modus operandi diverged in critical ways. The 2004 attack involved multiple wounds, chaotic and frenzied. This alley killing was singular. Controlled. The suspect's DNA did not match the preserved sample. The file closed again, not officially, but practically. Years slipped by. The victim's friends moved on, married, had children. The bar where she worked changed ownership twice. New employees heard whispers of the girl who was killed, but treated it like urban legend. Meanwhile, the family never stopped calling the precinct every August, asking for updates that rarely existed. In 2010, advances in forensic technology breathed faint life into old evidence. The DNA sample was re-examined using more sensitive amplification techniques. This time, analysts managed to build a clearer profile, still partial, but stronger. It was entered into CODIS again. Still no hit. Detectives explored the possibility that the killer had never been arrested for a felony. Maybe he'd moved out of state. Maybe he'd left the country. The theory expanded outward like ripples on water, impossible to contain. A journalist wrote a retrospective piece in 2012, labeling it one of Manhattan's most haunting unsolved murders. The article reignited public interest. Tips trickled in, some credible, most not. A psychic claimed to see water and a bridge. An anonymous email accused a former co-worker, but the IP address traced back to a library computer, unhelpful and anonymous by design. Then came the genealogical revolution. By the mid-2010s, cases once deemed impossible were being cracked through familial DNA databases. The success stories made headlines nationwide. Detectives revisited their evidence with renewed urgency. Could the degraded sample be enough for this new method? Laboratory technicians worked painstakingly, extracting what little remained. The profile was uploaded into a public genealogy database, following legal protocols. Weeks passed. Then months. A distant cousin match appeared, third or fourth cousin range. It wasn't a name. It was a thread. Investigators built a family tree, branch by branch, tracing lineage through birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. The tree expanded across states, decades, generations. From hundreds of potential relatives, they narrowed to males in the right age range, who had lived in or visited Manhattan in 2000. One name began to glow brighter than the rest. He had been 27 in 2000. 6'1", Lived in Hell's Kitchen for 8 months that year before relocating to New Jersey. No criminal record. Worked as a freelance graphic designer. Quiet. Unremarkable. Detectives placed him under discreet surveillance in 2018. He was married now. 2 children. Coach of a local youth soccer team. No visible signs of violence. But the DNA didn't care about appearances. They needed a direct sample. One evening, investigators retrieved a discarded coffee cup from a trash bin outside his office. It was sent to the lab. Days later, the results came back. Match. The partial DNA under the victim's fingernails aligned with the profile extracted from the coffee cup. Not a distant relation. Not a coincidence. Him. An arrest warrant was issued quietly. When officers knocked on his suburban door at 6:03 a.m., neighbors peeked through curtains, confused. He answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt, expression blank as they read his rights. His wife stood frozen behind him, children asleep upstairs. News exploded by noon. New York City 2000 cold case cracked. Arrest made after 18 years. The city that had nearly forgotten suddenly remembered everything. During interrogation, he denied it at first. Said he had never met her. Never been in that alley. Detectives presented the DNA evidence. He shifted in his seat. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Hours later, his story changed. He claimed it was consensual. That an argument escalated. That he panicked. But the precision of the wound told a different story. The indictment detailed the evidence meticulously. DNA under fingernails. Cell phone records placing him within a half-mile radius that night. Data newly recoverable from archived service provider logs. A former roommate recalled him coming home late, agitated, washing a dark jacket immediately. The courtroom filled on the first day of trial. The victim's family sat in the front row, older now, lines etched deeper into their faces. They listened as prosecutors reconstructed the night minute by minute, voice steady, methodical. Defense attorneys argued contamination, questioned chain of custody, attacked the reliability of genealogical databases. They painted him as a family man caught in a technological net woven from fragments of degraded DNA. Jurors watched crime scene photos projected onto a screen, brick walls, yellow tape, a single shoe lying on concrete. Silence filled the room as the medical examiner described the blade's trajectory once more. Outside, reporters recited phrases that had become familiar: long-awaited justice, community in shock, case finally solved. But inside the courtroom, the tension was personal, immediate, raw. When the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder, the victim's mother closed her eyes, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. 18 years of waiting condensed into a single word. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. And yet, even as headlines celebrated closure, the alley remained unchanged. Brick. Shadow. Echo. A place where one life ended and another unraveled, quietly, invisibly, until science caught up with memory. The city moved forward, as it always does. But for those who remember that August night, the air still feels heavy in that narrow corridor off West 46th Street, where a cold case once slept and where, after nearly 2 decades, it finally spoke. The verdict did not end the story. It detonated it. Outside the courthouse in New York City, microphones crowded the steps, satellite trucks idled with engines humming, and a name that had barely registered in public memory for nearly 2 decades, suddenly pulsed across every screen in America. Cold case cracked. DNA breakthrough. 18 years later. The phrases rolled like thunder, but inside the courtroom, when the jury foreperson spoke the word guilty, it did not sound like thunder at all. It sounded small. Final. Air leaving a room. He did not look at the victim's family as deputies led him away. His jaw tightened, eyes forward, shoulders squared in the stiff posture of a man still trying to control a narrative that had slipped irretrievably from his hands. Behind him, in the second row, his wife stared at nothing. The children were not there. They would learn later what the cameras already knew. The prosecution's timeline replayed in the public imagination with clinical precision. August 2000. 11:37 p.m. She clocks out. 11:58 p.m. A blurred shadow on Delhi footage. Midnight. A single blade angled downward, slipping between ribs, clean and practiced. The downward trajectory became the symbolic detail journalists could not stop repeating. Surgical, one headline said. Deliberate, said another. It was the word deliberate that stayed with people. It suggested intent. It suggested choice. But even after the conviction, questions lingered like static. Why her? Why that alley? Why that night? In sentencing, the judge spoke about time. About the cruelty of waiting. About the burden carried by a family forced to live in suspended grief. He spoke of advances in forensic science as if they were moral instruments, tools not just of evidence, but of eventual truth. 25 years to life. The number sounded heavy, but to the victim's mother, it could never measure the span between 24 and eternity. The defense filed an appeal within weeks. They challenged the genealogical database procedures, argued that distant relatives had never consented to being stepping stones in a homicide investigation. Civil liberties groups weighed in. Opinion pieces multiplied. Was this justice, or surveillance masquerading as science? The case that had once been a forgotten file now sat at the center of a national debate. Meanwhile, detectives who had worked the original scene revisited their memories in interviews. One retired officer admitted he still dreamed about the alley. He described the way the victim's hair had spread across the pavement, how quiet it was despite the city's constant roar. It didn't feel random, he said. It felt like someone had decided something. That phrase circulated too. Decided something. In prison intake photos, the man who once blended into suburban normalcy appeared smaller. The confident posture eroded, replaced by the slack weight of inevitability. He maintained, through counsel, that the encounter had not been premeditated. That an argument spiraled out of control. That fear drove the blade. Prosecutors countered with the wound itself, single, direct, fatal. Panic rarely strikes with such precision. The victim's friends gathered privately the night after sentencing. No cameras. No statements. They shared memories not of the alley, not of courtrooms, but of laughter at the bar where she worked, of late-night subway rides, of plans she had made for graduate school. The life interrupted became louder than the crime. For the family, closure was complicated. Justice delivered does not rewind time. It does not restore birthdays missed, holidays hollowed out by absence. The mother later admitted in a quiet interview that she expected relief to feel different. I thought it would be lighter, she said. But it's just different. The alley off West 46th Street remained physically unchanged, but perception altered it. True crime tours added it as a passing footnote. This is where the 2000 cold case happened, guides would say, voices lowered for effect. Visitors snapped photos of brick and shadow, trying to capture something intangible. Residents resented the spectacle, yet could not deny the weight embedded in the concrete. Appeals dragged through the system. In 2022, an appellate court upheld the conviction, ruling that the use of genealogical databases complied with existing legal standards. The decision fortified similar prosecutions nationwide. Prosecutors cited the case as precedent. Defense attorneys warned of a future where privacy eroded in the name of resolution. Inside his cell, he adjusted to routine. Early count. Meals on a plastic tray. Letters from his wife grew less frequent over time. The children stopped visiting after the first year. Isolation replaced denial. Fellow inmates knew his case. The phrase cold case carried a strange notoriety behind bars. It implied patience, inevitability, the long arm of something that never forgets. Detectives archived the file once more, this time stamped closed in red ink. The box that had traveled from shelf to shelf for 18 years found a permanent place in record storage. But digital copies lived on, scanned photographs, lab reports, interview transcripts, all preserved in servers humming quietly in climate-controlled rooms. The case would not fade the way it once nearly had. Journalists returned periodically, especially each August, to mark the anniversary. They interviewed new forensic experts, who explained how degraded DNA can whisper secrets decades later. They spoke to community activists, who argued that every unsolved murder deserves similar investment. They pointed to the backlog of cold cases still waiting for technology to catch up. And in quieter moments, away from headlines, the original question still flickered: what truly happened in those minutes between 11:58 and midnight? The defendant's version and the prosecution's theory aligned only on one fact: the two were alone in that narrow corridor. Everything else was inference stitched together by science and circumstance. The city, relentless as ever, layered new stories over old ones. Construction cranes rose, restaurants opened and closed, faces in the neighborhood changed. But memory does not obey zoning laws. It lingers in corners, in the way longtime residents glance down that alley a fraction of a second longer than necessary. For the victim's mother, justice became routine in a different way. She attended hearings when required, spoke at advocacy events about cold case funding, and kept her daughter's room intact for years before finally repainting the walls. Not to erase, but to continue living. The case influenced policy within the department as well. Evidence preservation protocols tightened. Cold case units received expanded resources. Training emphasized the importance of meticulous collection even when technology seems insufficient. Collect it anyway, instructors would say. The future might know what we don't. That philosophy, faith in a future solution, became the quiet hero of the story. In 2000, detectives could not have predicted genealogical databases, or the computational power that would reconstruct family trees from fragments. They preserved swabs and fingerprints not because they knew how they would be used, but because not preserving them would mean surrender. There is something unsettling about that patience. The idea that a crime can sleep for nearly 2 decades, and then awaken with a single lab result. It suggests that time is not erasure but incubation. The alley remains narrow. Brick remains brick. But if you stand there long enough, you can almost feel the layers of narrative pressing against one another: the night of the murder, the years of silence, the dawn knock on a suburban door, the courtroom's collective inhale before a verdict. They coexist, stacked invisibly in the same physical space. New York City 2000 cold case cracked became a headline, then a citation in legal journals, then a case study in forensic seminars. But beneath the academic analysis and media cycles lies a simpler truth: a life ended abruptly, and a city carried that absence until science forced an answer. The finality of a conviction does not silence the echo entirely. It only changes its tone. What was once a question becomes a memory. What was once uncertainty becomes record. Yet the emotional residue, the shock, the anger, the quiet grief, lingers beyond the gavel strike. And so the story continues not as an open wound, but as a scar visible to anyone who looks closely at the bricks off West 46th Street. A reminder that even in a city defined by noise and motion, there are moments that freeze in time, waiting for someone, years later, to finally turn on the light.